Hey, it's Dr. Astarbear, and in this lecture, we're going to be talking about socialism and communism. So, as we've discussed thus far in the course, uh, as Marx and Engels put it, the existing history that we have is a history of class struggle. It's a history of exploitation. Okay, so exploitation is very prevalent. You could say dominant, uh, prevalent uh, throughout recorded history. So that is the societies that we know of have been dominated by the taking of the surplus by those who did not produce it, right? So, we could consider, for example, slavery or the slave fundamental class process, very, very common historically, right? Or feudalism, and as Marx showed, capitalism, though it is much newer, produces a variation of the exploitation of these other modes of production that are much older. It doesn't eliminate exploitation by any means. It just offers a new kind, right? So if we take seriously the goal of Marxism, which is to say, look, this is a moral wrong that those who produce should also appropriate, they should own, they should control the fruits of their own labor, what their own labor produces. Uh, then how do we get there, right? What do we do to, given the prevalence of exploitation, what do we do to move away from that, to minimize that, and ultimately to abolish exploitation, to move beyond it altogether, right? So that becomes the big question, right? So a a moral wrong, right? And again, we want to move towards to minimize and then ultimately abolish exploitation altogether, right? Now, we don't have historical models of that happening really, right? So, especially, prior to the Russian Revolution, before the creation of the Soviet Union, that this was, very much a theoretical or kind of unknown territory that we're entering into. And by the way, that's very similar uh, to the development of capitalism itself, right? Capitalism was unknown before about 300 years ago, right? So the new changes and so forth, the new society that was being created uh, was something that people did not understand, right? It was a break with the past. So if we ask the question, what is socialism? It turns out this is a very contested term. There are many, many definitions, many possible meanings of that term, socialism, right? It's been used for a long time. The use of it predates Marx and Engels. They come into an established, tradition and discourse around this, right? What is socialism? But it is in general a kind of response, right, to say that society should not be organized only for the benefit of powerful elites, right? Um, that it should work for the average person. It's part of the movement for democracy and equality, and many many thinkers have said, yeah, let's keep going with that. Let's extend that, right? Let's have equality. Let's have democracy. Let's have voting for everyone, not just for the rich, not just for the privileged, which of course is how voting gets started, right? Voting is initially only for the aristocracy, right? That's like the British House of Lords, for example, right? Um, so first there's the House of Lords, and then there's the House of Commons, and initially these uneasily shared power. Anyway, the point is, right, everyone should have some say into how society is organized and for whom it distributes its fruits, right? So there's a broad kind of agreement among socialists. Of course, there's many different kinds of socialists, which Engels discusses in his work, uh, Socialism, uh, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. Right, so famous work there by Engels discussing the various different thinkers and movements within, under the heading of socialism. We're going to focus particularly on the view just within Marxism here, right? Um, Now, that's not because it's the only one, right? It's just because, Marxists have a very heavy influence here, right? From, like I mentioned, Engels and Marx himself, right? Um, so we're gonna focus our attention on, Marxist definitions of socialism, um, and let's before we can get there, let's actually talk about communism, right? So Marx defines, we have this idea, okay, we call it the communal fundamental class process or the communal class process. And again, that is those who produce also collectively appropriate their own surplus, right? So there is not somebody else who comes in and appropriates the surplus of the producer. The workers themselves, the producers themselves, do that. Okay, that's the communal class process. Okay, so we can take and extend that to create a notion of communism. Okay, to say, well, all right, those who are producing are also collectively appropriating, um, and but we want to kind of go beyond that, right? Because again, communism itself has a long history in terms of what does that actually mean. So let me just show you. Here we have the kind of most famous maxim of communism, which is from each according to ability and to each according to need, right? Now, what does this mean exactly, right? I mean, this is kind of like an aphorism here, right? Like, so it means that each should contribute as much as they can, right? Based on their ability. I mean, some people have greater ability, perhaps others have less. We have different abilities. We can produce different things. We have different skills. We have different interests. Uh, so the idea is each should contribute to society based on their ability, but they should receive from society not based on what they contribute, not based on what they produce at all, but based on what they need. Wow, that's a very big break with the way that society is typically organized, right? The typical organization is, you receive based on, many things, right? You're based on your position in society, but it has nothing to do with what you need, right? I mean, slavery, feudalism, and capitalism offer many, many examples of people who perish because they do not get what they need, right? I mean, there's no guarantee under an exploitative society, no guarantee whatsoever that you will get anything, right? Whether you need it or not is basically immaterial. Um, and so, there's a long tradition of people pointing out, well, that's pretty inhumane, you know? Um, that is treating other human beings like our kind of like our enemies. You can suffer and die, and that means nothing to me, right? Um, what would it mean to actually share, to cooperate, right? What would that look like? I mean, this is a question that has captivated many, many different thinkers and artists and writers over the years. So here's an example. This is the book Utopia, written in 1516. Thomas More describes a communist society in which private property has been abolished, labor has been reorganized to provide abundant wealth by increasing the percentage of the population doing labor, and wealth is distributed according to need. Gold has little value and does not determine anyone's decisions. Um, so again, a different kind of society being portrayed here, and More recognizes that this doesn't currently exist, right? I mean, that's why he calls it utopia, meaning no place, right? No place. Uh, but nonetheless, right, it's presenting a desirable, enlightened society. And weirdly enough, the society, this communist society in Utopia, does have slaves. So it's very, very strange. I mean, our ideas about slavery, of course, have changed considerably since the 1500s. Uh, all right. So we also find evidence of communism in Christian scripture, especially depicting the early Christians. So from Acts, here we have this statement here: all who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. So seeming to uplift that same idea, right? That we would distribute not on the basis of what people contribute, but on the basis of what they need. Um, and people also have different needs, right? So some might need more than others, right? I mean, think of someone who is disabled or ill, the elderly or children, right? These are all groups which may need more. And the questions: do we provide that, right? Do we collectively make a decision that everyone will have their needs met in the society? Okay, so another statement here. Now the whole group of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything they owned was held in common. There was not a needy person among them, for as many as owned lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold. They laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each as any had need. So from this kind of unique focus of Marx on the class process and the class structure, we could say a uniquely Marxist view of communism goes a little bit further, right? It's different from just that your needs are met, just that there's sharing, that there's collectivity and emphasis on the benefit of the group, all of these things, yes. But to add to that, to say communism is a society in which the communal fundamental class process is the dominant kind of production, and other fundamental class processes, uh, especially those involving exploitation, are suppressed, are minimized, or even are eliminated. Imagine that, right? Imagine a society which has totally eliminated exploitation. It does not exist, right? Perhaps it's seen as backward and barbaric, as the idea that, you could simply attack and kill somebody, for threatening you or whatever, right? Or for any reason, right? I mean, the might makes right idea. We typically now see that as that's barbaric, right? We have a society that's based on laws, and those laws should apply to all, right? That eliminates that kind of, or at least significantly reduces that kind of senseless violence, right? Um, so exploitation also causes a kind of structural violence and death. Why should we allow that, right? Why should we not try to move towards a society which eliminates that? Okay, so the next question then would be how, right? How do you actually do that? How would you eliminate exploitation? How would you move towards a society in which that communist fundamental class process, or communal fundamental class process, is dominant? Okay, so now Marx and Engels and the Marxists that followed have some very interesting things to say about this, right? Um, so Marx and Engels describe this as, what do we have now, right? Under capitalism, how does the government or the state interact with the capitalist fundamental class process? How does the state uphold that, right? So this is the currently the role of the state: uphold the capitalist FCP, okay, the capitalist fundamental class process. And in previous lectures we have talked about the state provides conditions of existence, that support this capitalist fundamental class process. So, for example, the idea that the product that is produced by workers, that is the private property of the capitalist, right? So who defends those private property rights? Who enforces those laws? Well, the state does, of course, right? And without that, you would not be able to have the capitalist fundamental class process would not be able to continue, right? So because the state plays such an important role here doing that, Marx and Engels refer to the role of the state, they call it the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, right? The dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. So this term bourgeoisie, by the way, this is a French word, right? So it's derived from it kind of has an initial meaning of like city dweller, right? So bourgeoisie, interesting word. It's kind of been kept alive by the Marxist tradition, right? So this means, capitalists plus, the supporters of capitalism. Okay, it's a kind of umbrella term, right? Because the capitalists, of course, are actually relatively few. Those who actually own and appropriate surplus value, it's a relatively small group in society, right? But if we include the supporters of this, those who believe that we should continue it, who support it, perhaps they even make a living, as the pundits and article writers and various intelligentsia that support. They're not capitalists themselves, but they're anyway part of the bourgeoisie. So this dictatorship of the bourgeoisie that we have, right? It's to convey the idea that look, the state acting for the average person, for the working class, that's not really on the table, right? I mean, you can vote if you want, but the options have already been limited. That every candidate who is running for office under capitalism supports capitalism, right? They are part of the bourgeoisie themselves, right? They're not anti-capitalists at all, right? So this is what we currently have, right? And what Marx and Engels say what we need, well, we need a dictatorship of the proletariat instead. Okay, right? Dictatorship of the proletariat. And proletariat, another word that is big in Marxism, means simply the working class. Okay, so the person who works for a wage, who does not own land or capital, right? So again, this is a kind of an umbrella term, that is used alongside more precise uh, terms for classes that are also in Marxism. In the uh, Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels offer. They try to really like summarize. Okay, what is the main thing that the communists are after? What is the let's just try to make it very clear, right? Because the Communist Manifesto is written for the average person, right? It's meant to be a popular piece of writing, and of course, it was very successful in that, right? It's something that one of the most widely read pieces of writing of all time, right? So they try to really sum it up, okay, and say, all right, so how do we get to this, right? How do we, we have a situation where the state is basically upholding exploitation of the capitalist kind, right? At the time that Marx and Engels are writing in 1848 for the Communist Manifesto, right? So their way of summing it up is to say, what are we for here? Well, we are for the abolition of private property, right? The abolition of private property. Wow. Okay. So, and they say very clearly, what do they mean by that? Well, they mean in terms of the means of production. Okay. The means of production. So that is the land, the tools, equipment, machinery, all right, what we usually call productive capital, right? The all of the other infrastructure that goes into it, the buildings and all of this stuff, right? All of the infrastructure that goes to produce other things, okay? So land, factories, any kind of productive capital, that should not, we should not allow that to be privately owned, okay? If it's privately owned, well, that's one of the conditions of existence for capitalist exploitation. And so that's the very thing that we need to change, right? We need to go from the state upholding this to the state abolishing it, okay? And they become even more detailed in this. They offer a whole list. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degree all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e., of the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. Right? Very interesting, right? Um, so even they're writing the Communist Manifesto from within the industrialized world, right? Industrial development is already happening, fairly rapidly by historical standards, and they're saying let's increase production even more rapidly. Uh, so they continue. Of course, in the beginning, this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads on the rights of property. Right. So what do they mean by that? Right. Look, the there's already private ownership of the means of production. We have to take that away. Right. I mean, there's otherwise it's going to continue to be privately owned. If we want to abolish that, we basically have to take away some people's property. I mean, that's unavoidable. Okay. Um, and on the conditions of bourgeois production, by means of measures, therefore, which appear economically insufficient and untenable, but which, in the course of the movement, outstrip themselves, necessitate further inroads upon the old social order, and are unavoidable as a means of entirely revolutionizing the mode of production. Okay, so this is their suggestion, right? How we might begin, in terms of moving toward a society that does not have exploitation. But this doesn't take us all the way there, right? Here's the thing, right? The society that we envision, okay, that this communism is something which we have to undergo a kind of a process to get there, right? Again, this does not currently exist, right? We have to take steps in order to get there, right? And so this is our question, right? It might take many steps, you know it might take society a long time to attain communism, okay? Just like, look, this transition, if we draw the parallel and say, well, what did it take for society to make this transition away from feudalism and to capitalism? Look, this took a long time as well. This didn't happen overnight. There's again many steps in that process. The feudal order, we have a kind of transitionary state here where the feudal order still existed for a long time, even as capitalism grew and developed and so forth. Ultimately, capitalism won and feudalism, is been minimized or abolished, no longer really exists, right? Except for in more limited uh, settings and so forth, right? It's certainly no longer the dominant mode of production, in the society as a whole. It no longer affects the political system and so forth. It still has its influence, but again, this is a transition which took time to develop. Okay, so the same thing, moving from capitalism to communism. Um, a lot of things are going to have to change in society because the exploitation does not just affect economic structures. Remember, everything is connected, right? That's the logic of overdetermination, of dialectical materialism. Every part of society is organically connected to every other part of society. You don't just get to change one thing and keep everything else constant, in the manner of the vulgar economists who like to say ceteris paribus, right, holding all else constant. That's anathema to Marxism, right? Marxism would never say you can hold everything constant. You change something, and other things are going to be changed as a result because everything is connected, everything else. What would these steps look like? Okay, let's go back to the Communist Manifesto. So they continue and say these measures will, of course, be different in different countries. Nevertheless, in most advanced countries, the following will be pretty generally applicable. So, number one, abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. Okay, so very much in line there with what's already been said about abolition of private property and the means of production. Two, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Three, abolition of all rights of inheritance. Four, confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. Five, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. Okay, so breaking there one of the key instruments that upholds capitalism, which is the entire apparatus of lending and finance. All right, six, centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. Seven, extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, the bringing into cultivation of wastelands, and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. Eight, equal liability of all to work, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. Nine, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of all the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the populace over the country. And 10, free education for all children in public schools, abolition of children's factory labor in its present form. Remember, this was written in the 1840s when children working in factories was still fairly common. Combination of education with industrial production, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that I think that et cetera, at the end there suggests that this is just the beginning of a list, and there could be many other ideas about concrete steps that you would take, right? There are, again, many steps in this transition from capitalism to communism. And Marxists really followed that and said, what do you call this transitionary state, where we're taking steps to try to reduce or minimize exploitation, but we haven't gotten there yet, all right? And the tradition was to call that socialism, to say, look, socialism is the state beginning to really change its ways, right? Instead of upholding capital, it is now attenuating that, right? It is reducing and minimizing exploitation wherever possible. But keep in mind, this list of items here, uh, it does not actually say anything about exploitation, right? Isn't that interesting? So the great theorist of exploitation, in his list of things and what should be done, does not actually mention that, right? Again, that conveys something about this idea that there's a transition that needs to occur and many, many things need to change, okay? So this transitionary state moving towards communism where the state begins to, be the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? To work on behalf of the working class rather than capital. That is socialism. Okay, Marx and Engels, I think are alluding in their list in the Communist Manifesto that one of the things that needs to happen as this transition occurs is economic development, right? Economic growth. They put a lot of emphasis on that, right? I mean, how many times in this list is it mentioned, that we want to really rapidly develop the economy? They've mentioned the establishment of industrial armies, and talking a lot about agriculture, right? So economic development and growth to get to the point, right? to increase the total wealth of the economy, right? Which then means there is more wealth that can be shared, right? We don't want to share our poverty, right? I mean, we don't want, okay, we're all a lot more equal, but we all have less or something. No, that or we there isn't totally enough for everyone, but we share it. No, we want to develop the forces of production. We want to produce more. We want a better life, not just for the rich, but for everyone, right? So, very strong emphasis here on economic development and economic growth, right? Now, Marx and Engels celebrate capitalism both for sweeping away the feudal exploitation, the brutality of that system, and also for rapidly developing the economy, right? They notice and appreciate that capitalism is generating more wealth, right? The problem with it is it's based on exploitation, and that wealth is not very broadly shared, right? It it increases wealth, but it also brings a tremendous amount of human suffering along with it, right? And that suffering is even less excusable because there's so much more wealth than there was before. But again, they're saying we need to go further with that, right? We need to continue that economic development. We don't want to stop that. We want to actually turbocharge it. The issue from class terms is that no class structure is specified here. Uh, no class structure is specified under socialism. Okay, Marx writes some beautiful things about communism, right? That in a communist society we would have the kind of ultimate aim here, right? Is again we have sharing and cooperation form the basis of society. We have no or very little exploitation, right? Well, let's go to the ultimate, right? So no exploitation whatsoever, right? Um, and after some time, perhaps, of living without exploitation, I mean, just it boggles the mind, really. I mean, like the more you know about history, the more you study society, um, the more aware you are of the various forms of exploitation that have existed, the harder it becomes to actually imagine, well, what might society be like without that? I mean, it's just really, it's mind bending, right? So, okay, so we have no exploitation, and Marx says, look, at some point, this distinction, which is so critical to Marxism, okay, that the distinction between necessary and surplus labor, right? That labor which goes to support oneself, one's own needs, versus that labor which is produces above and beyond that, right? The necessary and surplus labor distinction becomes forgotten, right? And we attain a state of classlessness, okay? So there is no longer the worker, the appropriator, and Marx even kind of gestures at this a kind of brief argument, but says even the distinction between which we now very much have, right? The distinction between labor and leisure, right? That distinction may also completely be forgotten. I mean, why is it that we see some activities as work and other activities as not work? I mean, what a strange idea that is, right? Could that have anything to do with exploitation? I mean, could it have anything to do with capitalism itself, right? Capitalism says, oh, this is you're working right now. That means your time is actually mine, right? I have purchased your labor power, and I'm going to do with it as I will. I'm going to make you work as hard and as rapidly and as productively as I can, right? So that I can exploit you more, right? So why should that distinction continue in a communist society where, hey, look, everyone gets what they need. You work because you work for the benefit of humanity, right? Um, there's a kind of statement of this in Star Trek, of all places, right? So Star Trek is, they don't go into too much detail about what the society looks like, but they do say, look, we have money, but we're not motivated by that, right? That doesn't make our decisions for us. We work not so that we won't perish, not so that we'll be rich. We work for the benefit of humanity, right? So, wow, what a lofty goal that is, right? Our work is for the benefit of all, right? Now, I mean, that's a very idealistic notion, which, in our current society, based as it is on exploitation and alienation and other forms of domination, right? That is something that is very difficult to imagine, right? Like, how on earth could you, how can you afford to do that, right? I mean, um, you have to make a living, right? Most of our time and attention and whatever is taken up with just getting by. Imagine if that was removed. Imagine if you could really think like, okay, what are the skills that I have, and how can I employ those skills to be of the maximum benefit to everyone, right? That's a question that we can hardly afford to ponder uh, under capitalism, right? We have to just think, okay, yeah, how can I use my skills in order to make a decent income, right? And that's generally speaking, that's hard enough to occupy you for many years, right? Uh, Maybe after retirement or whatever, if you were lucky enough to be able to do that, then maybe you could ponder it at that point, right? After your most of your productive life is over, um, right? The so Marx says, look, a human being is a species being. You know, we are not. It is not natural to us to say, okay, these activities are labor, these other activities are leisure. That this labor is unpleasant, leisure is pleasant. That it is capitalism that makes that the case, right? So this ultimate society is very difficult for us to even imagine, right? And again, this is why Engels calls this kind of thinking utopian. Marx too, right? To say, look, this doesn't currently exist. We're not really anywhere near that. We need to have some sense like this is a grand goal. It's a kind of a dream. You know, but that's what ideals are. We Marxism is driven by that ideal, right? Could we create a society that is free of exploitation and has all of these other much more desirable qualities? How would we do that, right? Let's try to take our idealistic vision and translate it into concrete practical steps, right? Now, there's some difficulties which are going to immediately come up here, right? Which is, okay, so the state is going to take away property from the rich, from the capitalists, from the bourgeoisie, right? And hold that and then use it for the benefit of the workers. Wow, right? Do you think that they'll be allowed to do that unimpeded? Do you think there won't be anyone who's upset about this, right? Uh, I think there probably will be some people that are upset about it, right? So again, this term, right, the dictatorship of the proletariat. I mean, what does that suggest, right? That the state must hold power in order to do this, right? In order to successfully manage this transitionary state away from capitalism and towards communism, the state has to be powerful, right? The state must hold power, and that means they have to manage dissent. Again, there's going to be some within the society who lose from this, right? The rich, capitalists, etc., right? Um, they have to stifle uh, a counter revolution, okay? Uh, Led by we could call that a bourgeois revolution or a bourgeois counter revolution, okay? And this might be very much funded by outside powers, right? So we have to keep that in mind. Of course, these are themes which play out as the socialist revolutions of the 20th century, unfold, right? And that's what we'll be discussing, next in the course. Thank you very much.